We're now going to move into a discussion on Brexit. As you've just heard, US and China trade dispute, that's one of the key factors in global trading, in the global trading landscape at the moment. But another one is obviously Brexit, the UK's decision to leave the European Union. The UK was due to leave this coming Friday, March 29. But Parliament in the UK has been unable to agree terms of a divorce in what has been a chaotic period in UK politics. The Prime Minister has managed to secure an extension, a brief extension, to the deadline from the EU to give her a chance to push some sort of deal through Parliament. She has now just 2 weeks to do so. Her withdrawal proposal, though, has already been defeated twice by a record margin. If the Prime Minister gets a deal through the UK Parliament, the deadline for the UK's departure will be extended to April 12 to enable Britain to propose a new way forward. If she is unable to get it through, to enable Britain to propose a new way forward. The story is very fast moving. There are reports in today's newspapers, the Sunday Times, saying that 10 ministers are trying to oust Prime Minister May. There was a demonstration in London yesterday, reportedly 1 million people marching through the streets to demand a second referendum. An online petition on the parliamentary website has now secured, or last I looked, 4.3 million votes to support a second referendum. So there's clearly a groundswell of opinion. But more than anything else, there is a lack of clarity about what might happen. And at stake is Britain's relationship with its major trading partner, the European Union, and some might say Britain's position in the world. One possible scenario, and it's still on the table, is that the UK will crash out of the European Union with no formal trade deal. That would have enormous implications for the UK economy and its trade with the rest of the world. One of the policies of the UK is to try to develop new trading agreements. It's been unable to do so while part of the European Union, and is in fact behind in its negotiations, according to all those close to it, about trying to roll over existing EU deals. So now, to discuss Brexit, I'm joined by Ruth Herkes, who's former State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, where she led Germany's global trade policy and EU and WTO trade negotiations. She now serves on a number of boards, including that of Asia House. I'm also joined by Lord Stephen Green, Chairman of Asia House. Now, Lord Green is a former CEO and Chairman of HSBC and previously served as UK Minister of Trade. He's an active member of the House of Lords, and therefore he's seen and participated in this extraordinary debate on Brexit. Please welcome them to the stage. Stephen, I have to start with you. We are maybe approaching the end game of Brexit. What's going to happen? What's the scenario? What's going to happen in the next 2 weeks?
Is this on?
It's on, yeah.
I wish I knew. We may be approaching the end game. The EU issued what might almost be described as an ultimatum. Either the government gets their deal through in this coming week, in which case an extension of a few weeks for technical reasons, or they don't, in which case just 2 weeks for Parliament to make up its mind what happens next. I don't want to make too many forecasts, but the general assumption is that she's going to find it very difficult to get her deal through, in which case I think we're into that shorter time frame during which Parliament has to take a view on a series of alternatives. So I don't know whether we're in the end game. I think this could possibly end very quickly with an exit and no deal, or it could possibly go on for months yet, because there's a sharp change of direction in the British approach. We'll see.
And Ruth, the European Union's role in this, it's not positive for either the EU or Britain to crash out without a deal, and that's widely accepted. There has been an ultimatum of sorts imposed. How does the EU navigate this?
I would hope that the EU is now set for the second part of the Brexit development, namely what in my view is even much more important to understand where the EU and a post-Brexit UK will want to go. I have no doubt in my mind that both the European Union and the UK will want a very meaningful trade and economic relationship going forward, whether we will revert to a situation prior to the whole Brexit debacle, namely a revoking of Article 50, or whether we go for a Norwegian-style shaping of the future trade and economic relations. But surely it is my hope that we will have sufficient focus, wisdom, and also clear leadership going forward on this. And Michael, with your permission, if you allow me, I really was emboldened by the statement of somebody on the previous panel, the editor of Kaishan News, who said even China now takes one of the core EU member states to test the Belt and Road, which, don't know whether that is an accurate assessment, but it is a very interesting one because it does pay tribute to the fact how life and kicking the EU is and will remain going forward.
Okay. Stephen, one thing that the Brexit debate seems to show is how deeply divided the UK is at the moment. Is that your take?
It absolutely does show. Indeed, the whole process from the referendum onwards has shown how deeply divided the UK is about its place in the world. The referendum itself was essentially a 50-50 split. It wasn't, of course, 50-50, it was 52-48. But in round terms, it showed that half the country wanted to be part of the EU and half the country didn't. It also showed deep splits regionally and by urban versus rural and so forth. And there was an interesting survey commented on in the Financial Times just a day or two ago of public opinion in Britain, and I'm afraid it shows that there's no majority for anything in very short terms. Any particular proposal for the way forward, you do not get as much as 50% support for. So this is still a deeply divided country, and I'm not sure how we get out of this very quickly. These divisions are too deep to be smoothed over. They have been exposed, and covering them up again, I think, is not an alternative. Anybody who thinks about this for more than 1 minute realizes that whatever the exact future relationship with the EU is going to be, there has to be an extremely close partnership. This is about trade, but it's also about so much more than trade. This is about security, about cyberspace, it's about travel, it's about the environment. There is such a broad set of relationships. They're conditioned by history and by geography, and the notion that Britain could kind of cut adrift from Europe and trade with the wider world as though Europe didn't exist, which you sometimes hear from the hardline Brexiteers, is arrant nonsense. It's just physically and technically and historically impossible.
And Ruth, has there been a lack of leadership in the EU, in Europe more broadly? Because, as Stephen just said, it's nonsense to suggest there won't be a close trading relationship, and yet we hear out now, a matter of weeks away, where Britain could crash out without any formal trade deal.
Well, I think we do need to pay tribute to the complexities of leading the EU machinery through a potential Brexit legislation and the UK leaving the European Union. It is easy, and I think everybody in this room knows how complex the Brussels machinery is. And it is not helped with the fact that a crucial European Parliament election is nearing. Having said this, and given the typical scenario setting of the European Union and its institutions, 2 years are more than enough time to come up with a more visionary leadership, to come up with a more transformational approach to what the European Union, the continent, wants to deliver in terms of keeping the UK, in many respects, a leading nation among the European nations, close by Europe, and in that respect, some statements that have been heard, in particular in recent days, coming from Paris, coming from other places, have not been to my utter delight. Let me just reference for once and for what it is worth, German unification. It is several decades away, but it was a similarly complex undertaking. Had we not had visionary leadership and an end goal and an understanding of why this matters beyond the day and beyond the complexities that were before us, it would not have happened. Even the sense of, what currency are we going to adopt? What kind of legal framework will it be? There was that leadership, and there was an underwriting from global powers, as there is, I think, an underwriting from global powers that the EU needs to go forward. So yes, there is an extraordinary lack of visionary leadership here on the part of the EU, who seems to hedge its bets.
Stephen, you're a former trade minister, and the hardliners in government say that countries will be queuing up to do trade deals with the UK when it's not part of the EU, it's not shackled to EU rules. If you were still trade minister, would you be that confident?
No, I certainly wouldn't. And indeed, I think the evidence of the last 18 months is that it's rather more difficult than some of the hardliners have said to do trade deals. Just take Australia for one example. In the referendum campaign, it was said by a number of the prominent Leave campaigners that it would be easy to do a deal with Australia. It'll take 10 months to get the deal done. It's proven nonsense. It is obvious that any meaningful deal with Australia, between Britain and Australia, Australia will want to seek better access to the agricultural and the food markets of Britain. That's a politically sensitive issue in Britain, just as it is in almost any country. And lo and behold, there's no deal yet with Australia. It will all take longer than expected. When I was Trade Minister, the EU launched its negotiations with Japan. I remember being part of the Trade Council meeting in Brussels where we signed off on the mandate for EU's negotiations. And I remember the then Trade Commissioner saying this will take 4 years. And I thought to myself, you'll be lucky. Dealing with Japan is going to be an extremely difficult, complex, slow process. But surprisingly, the EU have in fact done a, I think, rather imaginative and good deal with Japan. It's not yet fully ratified. It's not yet taken effect. Nevertheless, it will change the nature of relationships between the world's largest trading bloc and the world's, we need to never forget, still the world's third largest economy. Yeah. And that shows the benefit of the weight of the EU. Britain, it's not an insignificant economy, of course, but it doesn't have the weight of the EU, and it's going to find it much harder.
And Ruth, Europe seems to be on the cusp of a recession. I mean, there's a sharp economic slowdown there, and the departure of Britain, potential departure of Britain from the EU, doesn't seem to have given the EU, or the EU doesn't seem to have taken the message that it might need to reform. Do you get a sense from your dealings with in Europe that the EU takes these messages away, sees it as a recession, and needs to do something more?
I'm not entirely convinced that that is happening. The EU has always had, since the financial crisis some 10 years ago, to grapple with its internal economic and financial reforms, such as setting up, completing the banking union, maybe allowing more members into the monetary union, bailing out a number of EU countries that were failing as a consequence of the financial crisis. We are certainly dealing among the core EU partners with still a variety of economic models. You would, for instance, say that the French economic model is slightly different from the German economic model, and so is Spain, and so is Italy. So to expect that on the whole, given how much the EU has been seized upon going forward, I don't see the prospect that we will have just one message, apart from the fact that it is the biggest consumer market, that we care among the global regions, that we care about the so-called rules, and among them the 4 very important trading freedoms. We care about preserving global supply chains. We care about going forward with strong and meaningful trade relationships. But pushing ahead with strong economic performance remains, in my view, at large, the domain of each and every individual country.
Final question to you, Stephen. As former head of HSBC, you're very closely acquainted with global business. How damaging has the Brexit debate, the lack of clarity, the lack of resolution been in terms of Britain's position as a commercial centre?
I think it's too early to tell. Unquestionably, the British economy is weak at the moment. The growth is very slow. But as I was saying to Anne Ruth just before we started, what is striking to me is that Britain's growth rate, though slow, very slow now, is actually faster than Germany's or France right now. But underlying those headline numbers is a weakness of investment, which of course has a cumulative effect over time. Why would you invest at a time when you have so much uncertainty about the business conditions going forward? And the longer this lasts, the more subtle damage it does to the British economy, unquestionably. So we need to get clarity. It was very striking the other day that a joint statement, well, it wasn't in fact a joint statement, but simultaneously from both the British Confederation of British Industries, so the voice of business, and also the Trade Unions Congress, saying exactly the same thing. Get on with it, decide so that we know where we stand. And this is incredibly important. It's gone on now for effectively the best part of 3 years. Every month that goes by, we are losing opportunities, and we need to move on.
We have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we're out of time. In fact, we're considerably over time. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Anne Ruth Herkes and Lord Stephen Green.